Wesley Foster sat alone at his dining table when the evening news cut to a live eviction in Philadelphia. A black father knelt on the frozen sidewalk, tying his young son's shoe while their furniture sat piled behind them in the cold. His daughter clutched her backpack, hiding her face from the camera, while the boy asked where they would sleep that night. Then the camera panned to the building number above the door. Wesley's fork slipped from his hand. That address belonged to him. Before we get into what happened next, if you enjoy stories like this one, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's get back to the story. Wesley Foster had eaten dinner alone in that penthouse more nights than he could count. The kind of silence that came from a life built entirely around numbers instead of people. His father, Richard Foster, had taught him that a landlord's first mistake was seeing a tenant as anything more than a line item, and Wesley had carried that lesson into every deal he ever signed. He remembered standing beside his father in a boardroom decades earlier, barely out of college, listening to him tell a room full of investors that sympathy was the fastest way to bankrupt a real estate empire. Richard had built Foster Meridian Properties on that principle, and Wesley had spent 20 years proving himself worthy of the name by never once breaking it. 14,000 apartments across 6 cities ran through spreadsheets that never mentioned a single face. Wesley signed off on occupancy targets, late fee structures, and eviction timelines the way other men signed birthday cards, quickly and without much thought. He had built a life so thoroughly insulated from consequence that watching the evening news felt, most nights, like watching a foreign country. He had no idea, sitting down that particular evening, that the broadcast would reach directly into his own building and pull him out of that comfort by the collar. In Philadelphia, mornings in the Reed household ran on a rhythm Marcus Reed had built out of necessity and love in equal measure. He braided his daughter Amara's hair at the kitchen table while eggs cooked on the stove behind him, and he called out reminders to his son Isaiah to tie his shoes twice, not once, because the laces on his sneakers never held. Marcus moved through these mornings with a kind of quiet competence, the sort that only comes from 3 years of doing it alone, since his wife Danielle passed unexpectedly from a stroke that gave the family no warning at all. He never let the mornings feel rushed, even when they were. Marcus had spent nearly 8 years as a maintenance technician for a regional freight company, the kind of job that never made headlines but kept a family steady. He paid his rent on time, fixed his neighbor's leaky faucets without being asked, and had never once had a complaint filed against him in the 6 years his family lived at 1847 Kensington Avenue. He was the kind of tenant most landlords never think about, because he never gave them a reason to. That invisibility, it would turn out, was exactly what made him easy to erase. The freight company lost its largest shipping contract without much warning, and within a week Marcus was one of dozens of employees handed a folder with 2 weeks of severance and a form letter thanking him for his service. He drove home that afternoon rehearsing how he would tell Amara and Isaiah that nothing was going to change, because that was the promise he had made to himself the day Danielle died. He would not let his children feel the ground shifting under them, even as it shifted hard beneath him. He applied everywhere he could think of that week, took on small appliance repairs for cash, and picked up late-night delivery shifts that left him running on barely 4 hours of sleep. None of it added up fast enough to cover rent, groceries, and the after-school costs that came with raising 2 kids alone. When the first missed payment notice arrived, Marcus did exactly what he had always done when something in his life needed fixing. He picked up the phone and called the property management company directly. The call went the way most of his calls to Pinnacle Property Group had gone that month. A recorded voice guided him through 4 different menus before connecting him to a representative who took his information, told him someone would follow up about a payment plan, and then never called back. Marcus tried again 3 days later and reached a different representative who had no record of his first call at all. He kept a small notebook by the phone after that, writing down the date and time of every call, because some instinct told him he would need proof that he had tried. By the second missed payment, Marcus drove down to the Pinnacle office in person, hoping a face might accomplish what a phone number could not. The receptionist told him the property manager was unavailable and offered to leave a note, the same offer she had made the week before. Marcus stood in that lobby a moment longer than he needed to, the kind of stillness that comes from a man running out of doors to knock on. He He left without an appointment, without a callback promised, and without the sense that anyone on the other end of that building had any intention of listening. 14 phone calls and 2 in-person visits later, the notice on his door was no longer about a missed payment. It was an eviction order, dated and stamped, giving him a window of days he had already begun burning through simply trying to be heard. He sat his children down that night and told them the truth in the gentlest words he could find, that they would need to stay somewhere else for a little while, and that it had nothing to do with anything they had done. Amara, being 10, understood enough to be frightened. Isaiah, being 6, mostly wanted to know if his stuffed dinosaur was coming with them. The morning of the eviction arrived with a cold that cut through even the thickest coats, the kind of Philadelphia winter that turned sidewalks into sheets of ice. Marcus knelt down in front of Isaiah on that frozen pavement, tying his son's shoelaces into a double knot while movers carried the last of their furniture out to the curb behind them. Amara stood off to the side, arms wrapped around her backpack, angling her body so her face stayed out of the news camera that had shown up to document the scene like it was nothing more than a segment between weather and sports. A reporter asked Marcus a question he barely registered, something about how he felt watching his home get emptied onto the street. He answered without much emotion in his voice, because he had learned that showing panic in front of his children only made things worse for them. Isaiah looked up at him in the middle of it all and asked, in the plain, unguarded way only a 6-year-old can manage, where they were going to sleep that night. Marcus didn't have an answer yet, but he made sure his voice sounded like he did. 200 miles away, Wesley Foster sat at his dining table with a plate in front of him he hadn't touched, the television playing quietly, as background noise the way it always did during his solitary dinners. He wasn't really watching until the anchor's voice shifted into that practiced tone reserved for human interest segments, the kind meant to tug at viewers for exactly 90 seconds before cutting to commercial. The footage showed a father kneeling on ice, a daughter hiding her face, a boy asking where he would sleep. Wesley set his fork down without meaning to, something about the scene refusing to let him look away. It was the number above the door that stopped him cold, the way the camera lingered just long enough for him to read it clearly. 1847 Kensington Avenue was not a name he recognized from memory, but it was a name he recognized from his portfolio, one of thousands of addresses that lived quietly inside a database he rarely opened himself. He sat there for a long moment, plate forgotten, replaying the segment in his mind until he was certain he hadn't misread it. Then he got up, walked to his office down the hall, and opened his laptop before he had even decided what he was looking for. The property file loaded slower than he wanted it to, and when it finally did, Wesley found himself staring at a payment history that told a very different story than the one Pinnacle's system had apparently told the courts. Marcus Reed had paid on time for 70 of the past 72 months, missing only twice in nearly 6 years of tenancy. Attached to the file was a note from the property management team describing him as unresponsive, a word that sat strangely next to the 14 logged phone calls Wesley found buried 3 folders deeper, calls that had gone nowhere despite being made exactly as the system required. Wesley leaned back from the screen and sat with that contradiction longer than he expected to. This wasn't a clerical error slipping through the cracks of a large organization. Every fee, every automated notice, every fast-tracked filing had happened exactly the way the system was designed to happen, a system built on policies he himself had approved without ever imagining a face behind them. For the first time in 20 years, Wesley understood that the machine hadn't failed. It had worked exactly as intended, and a family had lost their home because of how well it worked. He sat in his office until well past midnight, torn between 2 very different versions of how the next morning could go. One version had his communications team drafting a statement, quietly settling whatever needed settling, and moving on before the story gained any real attention. The other version had him getting on a plane. Wesley thought about his father's voice, the old lesson about tenants being numbers, and realized for the first time that following that lesson had led him directly to a 6-year-old asking a stranger's camera where he was going to sleep. By sunrise, Wesley had booked the first available flight to Philadelphia, a decision that surprised even him given how long it had been since he'd set foot inside one of his own buildings without an assistant, a lawyer, or a camera crew standing between him and the people who lived there. He wasn't sure yet what he intended to say to Marcus Reed, or whether the man would even want to hear from him. But he knew he could no longer sit in that penthouse pretending the address on his screen belonged to someone else's problem. It belonged to him, and so did whatever came next. Wesley landed in Philadelphia a little after 9 in the morning, carrying nothing but a garment bag and the address he had memorized the night before. The taxi ride from the airport gave him more time than he wanted to sit with his own thoughts, watching the city shift from glass towers into row houses the closer they got to Kensington Avenue. He had visited hundreds of properties on paper over the years, studied their financials down to the decimal, but he realized somewhere around the 15th minute of that ride that he had never once walked through the front door of a building he owned without someone briefing him beforehand on what to say. The building itself told him more in 30 seconds than any quarterly report ever had. The front door didn't latch properly, swinging open on its own weight when Wesley pushed it, and the hallway light above the mailboxes flickered in a way that suggested it had been flickering for months rather than days. He climbed the stairs because the elevator had an out-of-service sign taped to it with yellowing tape, and by the second floor, he could feel the cold seeping through the walls in a way that told him the heating system wasn't just unreliable, it was barely functioning at all. An older woman stepped out of her apartment as Wesley reached the landing, eyeing him with the particular suspicion reserved for strangers in unfamiliar suits. Her name was Odessa Harmon, and once she understood who he was, her suspicion didn't soften so much as sharpen into something more direct. She told him plainly that Marcus Reed had fixed her door lock twice that year, free of charge, because nobody from the management company had ever bothered to send anyone. She said it the way people say things. They've been waiting a long time for someone important enough to hear. Odessa kept talking before Wesley could respond, describing how Marcus had carried a neighbor's stroller up 3 flights of stairs more times than she could count, how he checked on her during the last cold snap to make sure her radiator was working when his own barely was. She wasn't offering this information as praise so much as evidence, laid out plainly for a man she clearly held responsible for something. Wesley thanked her and continued down the hallway, her words sitting heavier in his chest than he expected them to. From the building, Wesley went straight to the local office of Pinnacle Property Group, the company his own firm paid to manage properties like this one. He asked to see the full eviction file for Marcus Reed, and the regional manager who eventually met with him seemed more confused by the request than concerned by it. The system, she explained, automatically applied late fees after a grace period, generated notices without requiring a human signature, and forwarded unresolved cases to the courts on a fixed timeline designed to minimize administrative overhead. Wesley asked her directly why no one on her team had ever picked up the phone and spoken to Marcus as a person rather than a case number. She answered without any defensiveness at all, which somehow made the answer worse. Pinnacle followed the procedures Foster Meridian itself had approved years earlier, procedures designed to move cases quickly and avoid the kind of case-by-case exceptions that slowed down portfolios this size. She wasn't hiding anything from him. She was simply doing her job, exactly as his own company had instructed her to do it. That answer left Wesley with nowhere to point his anger except back at himself, and he sat in his rental car outside the Pinnacle office for a long while before starting the engine. He had come to Philadelphia, half expecting to find someone to blame, a careless employee or a broken process he could fix with a phone call. Instead, he had found a system running exactly as designed, a system with his own name on the deed behind every decision. He drove toward the family shelter with that realization, sitting in his stomach like something he had swallowed too quickly. The shelter Marcus and his children had been placed in wasn't built for fathers raising young children alone, something Wesley understood the moment he walked through its doors. Most of the private rooms were reserved for mothers with infants, leaving men like Marcus to sleep on a folding cot near the entrance, while his children shared a thin mattress behind a curtain strung up for privacy. Wesley found Marcus sitting on that cot, elbows on his knees, looking like a man conserving every ounce of energy he had left for his children rather than himself. Wesley introduced himself, and to his surprise, Marcus already knew exactly who he was before the sentence finished. There was no gratitude in Marcus's expression when Wesley offered help, only a tired, guarded steadiness that made clear he had met men like this before, men who showed up with good intentions and vanished just as quickly. Marcus told him plainly that he didn't need someone wealthy showing up with a few bags of groceries and a photo opportunity. What he needed was a stable job, a safe place for his children to sleep, and someone who would actually answer the phone before his family ended up on the street again. Wesley left the shelter that first day without much to show for it, but he came back the next morning anyway, and then the morning after that. He brought clothes for the children and a stack of workbooks for Amara, and one afternoon he spent nearly an hour on the floor helping Isaiah reattach a wheel to a small toy truck that had broken somewhere between the old apartment and the shelter. Marcus watched these visits from a distance at first, never quite thanking Wesley for them, but never asking him to stop either. During the hours Marcus spent out on interviews, Wesley sat with Amara while she worked through her homework, learning in bits and pieces the shape of the life this family had been living long before eviction ever entered the picture. He learned that Marcus had refused to let relatives split the children up after Danielle died, choosing instead to rearrange his entire life around keeping Amara and Isaiah together under one roof. He learned that Marcus had taught himself to braid hair from video tutorials at 2 in the morning, and that he had sold off his tools, his backup wedding ring, and eventually his truck before ever considering selling the children's books and toys. Amara mentioned once, without any particular emotion in her voice, that she had started keeping extra food from the school cafeteria in her backpack in case Isaiah got hungry later. Isaiah, for his part, kept asking anyone who would listen whether they were going to have to move again soon, as though the question itself had become a kind of routine. Wesley carried these details home with him each night, turning them over long after he should have been asleep, feeling something shift in him that had nothing to do with balance sheets. The fragile trust Wesley had built over those visits collapsed one evening when Marcus happened to catch a business news segment playing on the shelter's small television. The anchor introduced Wesley Foster as the chief executive of Foster Meridian Properties, and Marcus sat frozen in front of the screen as the pieces rearranged themselves in his mind. The man who had been sitting with his daughter every afternoon wasn't a stranger who had simply heard about their situation. He was the owner of the very building that had put them on that sidewalk in the first place. When Wesley arrived the following morning, Marcus was waiting for him at the entrance, blocking the doorway before Wesley had even fully stepped inside. His voice stayed low, but there was nothing gentle in it. He asked Wesley how long he had planned to let the visits continue before mentioning who he actually was, and Wesley opened his mouth to answer before realizing he didn't have anything close to a good excuse. Marcus didn't wait for one anyway. He told Wesley that showing up with clothes and toys didn't undo what had already happened, that a man could not build a system that destroyed a family and then arrive afterward to play the role of savior. Wesley tried to explain that he hadn't known, that the decisions had been buried in policies he'd approved years ago without ever picturing a face attached to them. Marcus cut him off, asking what difference that made to Amara and Isaiah, who had lost their home, regardless of how many layers of approval stood between Wesley and the eviction notice. Wesley stood there absorbing every word without defending himself further, because some part of him understood that Marcus was right, in a way that no explanation could soften. The conversation ended with Marcus telling him, plainly and without raising his voice, that he no longer wanted Wesley anywhere near his children. Wesley left the shelter that day carrying a different kind of weight than he had walked in with, the quiet recognition that he had gone from a stranger trying to help to the very source of the harm in the eyes of the person he most wanted to make things right with. Marcus explained, once Wesley had backed away from the doorway, that the hardest part of everything wasn't losing the apartment itself. It was the feeling of having failed as a father in front of his own children, watching Amara shield her face from a camera while their furniture sat piled on a frozen sidewalk. He pointed out, without much anger left in his voice by that point, how easily people looked at an unemployed black father and assumed carelessness, without ever asking how many years he had paid rent on time, how many nights he had gone without sleep to keep his children fed, how many times he had called a company that never called back, It was Amara who delivered the moment that stayed with Wesley longest. Stepping out from behind her father during that same conversation and looking directly up at him, she asked him plainly whether he was the one who had taken their home away. Wesley opened his mouth to answer and found that nothing came out, no explanation adequate enough to meet the simplicity of her question. He returned to his hotel room that night and sat on the edge of the bed for a long while before opening his laptop again. This time Wesley didn't stop at Marcus's file. He pulled the eviction records for every property in the Foster Meridian portfolio over the past year, watching the numbers accumulate into something far larger than one family's misfortune. Hundreds of tenants had lost their homes under circumstances strikingly similar to Marcus's, most of them long-term renters who had fallen behind only after losing a job, surviving an accident, or grieving a death in the family. Every file used the same clinical language, describing people as unresponsive, non-compliant, or lacking payment capacity, regardless of how hard they had actually tried to reach someone. Wesley sat with that pattern until well past 2 in the morning, understanding now that the system hadn't simply erased people's circumstances. It had manufactured a convenient story that made every one of them look like the party at fault, which meant no one within Foster Meridian ever had to feel responsible for what happened next. He thought about his father's old lesson again, the one about tenants being nothing more than numbers on a ledger, and realized for the first time that the lesson hadn't protected the company from failure. It had simply hidden the failure from view. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, Wesley picked up his phone and called his chief operating officer, waking the man from a sound sleep. He gave a single instruction, without room for negotiation, ordering an immediate freeze on every eviction across all 14,000 units in the portfolio. No new filings were to be submitted, no pending eviction orders were to proceed, and no family was to be removed from any property until every policy behind these decisions had been reviewed from the ground up. His executive team pushed back within hours, warning him of the financial exposure, the potential lawsuits, and the very real possibility that the board could move to remove him from the company his own father had built. Wesley listened to every objection without backing down from the order, understanding for the first time in 20 years that protecting himself was no longer the priority guiding his decisions. He thought of Isaiah turning a broken toy truck over in his hands, of Amara hiding food in her backpack for her brother, of the question she had asked him without any anger in her voice at all. Whatever came next for Foster Meridian Properties, Wesley understood that he could no longer run it the way his father had taught him to. The version of himself that believed tenants were only numbers had ended somewhere on that frozen sidewalk on Kensington Avenue, and there was no going back to it now. The eviction freeze took effect within 48 hours, but the silence that followed inside Foster Meridian's executive offices was anything but peaceful. Wesley's board convened an emergency call before the ink on his memo had even settled, several members openly questioning whether a single news broadcast had rattled him into a decision that could cost the company millions in delayed revenue, and pending litigation from tenants who had already been removed under the old policy. Wesley sat through the call without raising his voice, understanding that no explanation involving Marcus, Amara, or Isaiah would land the way it needed to with people who still saw the portfolio as a spreadsheet rather than a collection of homes. He knew that freezing evictions alone wouldn't prove anything beyond a temporary reaction to bad press, and he understood that Marcus, of all people, would see through a gesture that didn't outlast the news cycle. Wesley spent the following days working with his property team to identify a vacant, renovated 2-bedroom unit inside the very building Marcus had been forced out of only weeks earlier. He arranged 6 months of rent waived entirely, followed by a payment plan built around whatever income Marcus could realistically bring in once he found steady work again. Finding that steady work took another set of calls, this time to contacts Wesley had never bothered building relationships with before, city transit officials who ran the maintenance divisions for the public transportation system. Marcus's 8 years of technical experience translated almost perfectly into an open technician position, one that came with health insurance, a fixed schedule, and an after-school care subsidy for employees raising children alone. Wesley put the offer together not as a favor extended from one man to another, but as compensation for opportunities Marcus should have had access to long before any of this happened. When Wesley presented the apartment and the job to Marcus, he did not receive the response he might have hoped for. Marcus sat with the offer for a long moment, turning it over with visible discomfort, before explaining that accepting anything from Wesley risked turning his family into a public relations story, a tidy narrative about a billionaire swooping in to fix what he'd broken. He said he didn't want Amara or Isaiah growing up believing their father had needed rescuing by a rich stranger in order to survive. Wesley didn't argue the point, because some part of him understood that Marcus wasn't entirely wrong to be cautious. Instead, he wrote out a short note and handed it to Marcus rather than trying to talk him into anything. The note read simply that this wasn't charity, but rather what the system already owed him. Marcus read it twice before folding it and putting it in his jacket pocket without saying much else that day. It was Amara and Isaiah, in the end, who tipped the decision, their need for stability outweighing whatever pride or caution Marcus still carried. He agreed to take the apartment and the job, but made it clear to Wesley that his agreement wasn't the same as forgiveness. Wesley accepted that distinction without pushing back, recognizing for the first time that repairing the damage he'd caused didn't automatically earn him the right to be forgiven for causing it in the first place. The larger question facing Wesley wasn't Marcus's case alone, and he knew it. He could have quietly resolved this one family situation, let the news cycle move on to the next story, and continued running Foster Meridian exactly as his father had built it. Sitting in his hotel room that final night in Philadelphia, Wesley understood that choice would make him no different from the system that had produced Marcus's eviction in the first place. He chose instead to dismantle the very structure that had gotten him here. Back in Chicago, Wesley terminated Foster Meridian's contract with Pinnacle Property Group entirely, replacing it with an internal management division built from the ground up. He called a meeting with his senior staff to lay out a new set of policies, and the room's reaction wasn't universal agreement. One longtime operations director pushed back hard, arguing that requiring 3 direct contact attempts before filing any eviction would slow the entire portfolio down and hurt quarterly performance across every city they operated in. Wesley answered that objection the same way he had answered every other one since that night at his dining table, by describing exactly what had happened to Marcus Reed, down to the 14 unanswered calls and the 2 ignored office visits. He explained that no tenant would ever again be labeled unresponsive without a documented, verified record of actual contact, and that families with young children would receive a minimum 90-day extension before any filing could proceed. Every building would have an independent tenant advocate, and every eviction decision would pass through a review panel made up of management, community advisors, and that same tenant representative, rather than an automated system that had never once considered the person behind the file. Tenants facing sudden hardship would also gain access to financial counseling and job placement support, so that a lost paycheck no longer had to mean a lost home. The operations director asked, not unreasonably, how any of this would be sustainable at the scale Foster Meridian operated on. Wesley didn't have a perfect answer that day, only the conviction that a portfolio built on erasing people's circumstances wasn't sustainable either, no matter how efficient it looked on paper. He told his team that tenants would now be evaluated on their actual situations rather than a flattened payment history, and that this shift wasn't optional, regardless of how uncomfortable it made anyone in that room. Marcus and his children moved into the renovated apartment on a Saturday morning, carrying far less than they once owned but somehow standing straighter than they had in months. Amara set her backpack down just inside the door but didn't unpack it right away, asking her father quietly whether he was sure nobody would come to take this room from them the next morning. Marcus didn't have a perfect answer for her either, only the promise that he would do everything in his power to make sure that didn't happen again. Isaiah ran straight to the front door the moment they arrived, turning the new key in the lock over and over as though testing whether it was real. He looked up at his father and asked if this key truly belonged to them now, and Marcus knelt down to his son's level, placing the key firmly in Isaiah's small hand and telling him yes, this was their home. Even as he said it, Marcus understood that having a roof again didn't erase what his children had already lived through: the sidewalk, the shelter, the curtains strung up for privacy. Some things simply had to be carried forward alongside the relief. Marcus started his new position with the city's transit division not long after. And it didn't take long for supervisors to notice the discipline and problem-solving instincts he brought to the job every single day. Within several months, he was accepted into a supervisory training program, a step up that came with more responsibility and a schedule that finally let him plan his evenings around his children instead of around whichever shift needed covering. Marcus also began quietly helping other single fathers he met along the way, walking them through job applications, childcare subsidies, and the early warning signs of an eviction notice before it became unstoppable. Wesley didn't disappear from the building once Marcus's situation had been resolved, something Marcus noticed even while keeping his distance. Wesley returned to Kensington Avenue repeatedly over the following months, sitting in on community meetings and speaking directly with residents rather than sending representatives in his place. Marcus remained guarded through most of these encounters, but slowly began to recognize that Wesley wasn't chasing another headline or a redemption moment for the cameras. He was working deliberately and without much public fanfare to change how his entire company operated. 6 months after the new policies took effect, the numbers inside Foster Meridian told a story none of the executives who had objected in that first meeting expected to see. Eviction filings across the portfolio had dropped sharply. Tenant retention had climbed in nearly every building, and the costs once spent on litigation, vacant unit repairs, and constant tenant turnover had fallen right alongside them. Wesley sat with those figures longer than he needed to, absorbing a truth his father had never once allowed himself to consider. Treating people with basic decency wasn't simply the right thing to do. It was also the more sustainable way to run a business, something a spreadsheet alone could never have taught him. 18 months after that frozen morning on the sidewalk, the building on Kensington Avenue looked almost unrecognizable from the one Wesley had first walked through. The front door locked properly now. The hallway lights stayed on without flickering. The heating system ran reliably through the coldest months, and the elevator had been fully repaired. The ground floor, once an unused storage space, had been converted into a community center where residents could gather, something Odessa Harmon had specifically requested during one of the tenant meetings Wesley now regularly attended. Wesley used what he had learned from Marcus's case to launch something larger, an organization he called the Open Door Initiative, designed to provide emergency rental assistance, legal counsel, and job placement support for families across the country facing eviction. Marcus agreed to join its advisory board as a tenant representative, a role he approached with the same quiet seriousness he brought to everything else in his life. At the initiative's public launch event, Wesley stood in front of residents and reporters and admitted plainly that he had once owned this building without ever truly seeing the people living inside it. Marcus followed him to the microphone shortly after, and he didn't present himself as anyone extraordinary. He described himself simply as a father who had lost his job for 2 months after nearly 6 years of paying rent on time without a single complaint against his name. He told the room that no man should be labeled irresponsible simply because a system refused to listen to his side of the story, and that no child should lose their home because their father needed a little more time to find work. He closed with a line that Wesley would carry with him long after the event ended, that his children didn't need a hero, only people with power willing to actually meet their responsibilities. Several months later, Wesley sat alone in that same penthouse, watching a news segment about the Kensington Avenue building play across his television screen. Marcus appeared on camera in his transit technician uniform, steady and unremarkable in the way most working people are, while Amara helped younger children with their homework inside the community center behind him. Isaiah could be seen through a window, running across a small yard with a soccer ball, laughing at something just out of the camera's reach. The reporter noted that the Open Door Initiative had already helped numerous families avoid eviction, and that other companies were beginning to study the model Wesley had built. Wesley turned the television off once the segment ended, sitting for a moment in a penthouse that remained just as large as it had always been, the same table still set for 14 guests who rarely, if ever, came. But the silence in that room no longer felt like evidence of an empty life the way it once had. His father's old lesson, the one about tenants being nothing more than numbers, no longer occupied the space in his mind it once had. In its place was Amara's question from that shelter hallway, asking plainly whether he was the one who had taken their home away. Wesley understood, sitting there in the quiet, that he could never change his answer to that question. What happened on that sidewalk had happened, and no policy reform or renovated apartment could undo it. But he could decide, every day going forward, what he chose to do after answering it honestly. The address that had appeared on his television screen that first frozen evening had never been just another building in his portfolio. It was his responsibility, and in truth, it always had been. If this story reminded you that it's never too late to make things right, that's really the whole point of sharing it. If you'd like more stories like this one, stick around and subscribe so the next one finds you too. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.